You've probably noticed this. You buy fresh ground beef. It looks okay in the package, but when it hits the pan, the texture seems off. It releases tons of water and just doesn't taste right.
But you guys, it's not...
Bro, did you see that meat? Like, what is it? That's not ground beef. I don't know what they are using for food nowadays.
Walk into any grocery store today, and everything looks absolutely perfect. The apples are flawless. The shelves are fully stocked. But when you take that food home, something feels deeply off. The fruit looks fresh, but the taste is totally flat. The chicken cooks fine, but the texture is strange. Why does our food look better than ever, but feel less real every single year? We all have a simple mental model of food. It should ripen, soften, and eventually spoil in predictable ways. But today, fruit stays firm longer. Ice cream refuses to melt normally. When that natural pattern breaks, it creates a quiet, creeping uncertainty. Over half of our calories now come from ultra-processed foods, and that massive shift completely changed how food is designed.
Walk into a grocery store today and everything looks perfect. The apples are flawless. The lettuce is bright and untouched. The shelves are full, clean and consistent. Nothing looks wrong. But then you take that food home, and something feels off. The fruit looks fresh, but the taste is flat. The ice cream holds its shape longer than you expect. The chicken cooks fine, but the texture is not always the same. None of these things are extreme. Most of them have normal explanations. Storage, transport, processing. But when it keeps happening, people start noticing. Because this is the strange part. Food in the United States is more controlled than ever. It is safer, more available, and more consistent than it used to be. And yet at the same time, more than half of all calories now come from ultra-processed foods, according to the CDC. That shift did not just change what people eat. It changed how food is made, how it behaves, and how it is designed. So the question is not whether food is fake. That is too simple. The real question is this: why does food look better than ever, but feel less real every year? That is what we are going to break down. Most people do not start with labels or ingredients. They start with small moments that feel slightly off. You buy fruit that looks ready, but it does not ripen the way you expect. It stays firm longer or softens unevenly. You cook chicken that looks normal, but the texture feels different from one package to the next. You leave something in the fridge a bit too long expecting it to spoil, and it holds its shape better than it used to. Individually, none of these are unusual. There are clear reasons behind most of them. Produce is often picked earlier so it can survive transport. Cold storage is more advanced than it was a decade ago. Meat processing is more standardized, which can change texture slightly. All of that makes sense. But people are not reacting to one explanation. They are reacting to repetition. When the same kinds of small inconsistencies show up across different foods in different stores over and over again, it starts to feel less like coincidence and more like a pattern. And that is where expectations come in. Most people have a simple mental model of food. It should ripen, soften, spoil, or break down in predictable ways. That is how people learn what fresh food is supposed to feel like. It is not something they study. It is something they experience over time. When that pattern becomes less consistent, even slightly, it creates a gap between expectation and reality. Not panic. Not a strong reaction. Just a quiet uncertainty. And once that uncertainty is there, people start paying attention to everything else. The taste, the texture, the labels, the way different products compare to each other. So before any discussion about processing or ingredients, this is where it begins. Food stops behaving the way people expect it to. And that is usually the point where the question shows up. What changed? To understand what changed, you have to look at how food is actually made today. For most of human history, food came from a simple chain. It was grown, harvested, and then cooked. Even when it was preserved or processed, the structure stayed recognizable. Ingredients were combined, not rebuilt. That is no longer the dominant model. A large share of modern food is not assembled in a kitchen. It is formulated in a production system. Instead of starting with whole ingredients, it often starts with components. Oils extracted from crops, starches modified for stability, proteins isolated and reworked. These are then combined into products designed to meet specific targets. Cost, shelf life, texture, consistency. This is where ultra-processed foods come in. According to data from the CDC, more than half of total calorie intake in the United States now comes from this category. That does not mean all of it is harmful, but it does mean a significant portion of what people eat is no longer traditional food in the usual sense. It is engineered to behave in predictable ways. That predictability is valuable. It allows products to stay stable during transport, last longer on shelves, and taste the same every time someone buys them. From a system perspective, it solves real problems. But there is a trade-off. When food is built to meet performance targets, it starts to follow different rules than fresh food. It does not change at the same rate. It does not always respond the same way to cooking or storage. It is more controlled but also more uniform. And that uniformity can feel unfamiliar, because most people are not used to interacting with food that has been designed this precisely. They are used to variation, slight differences in taste, texture, and timing. That variation is part of how people recognize something as natural. So when food becomes more consistent across the board, it can feel less connected to that expectation. Not because it is fake in a literal sense, but because it is built differently from what people are used to. This shift from cooking to manufacturing does not explain everything on its own, but it sets the foundation. Because once food is treated as a product, the next step is not just making it stable. It is making it appealing in very specific ways. Once food becomes something that is formulated, the next step is obvious. It is not just about making it stable. It is about making it appealing in a very controlled way. This is where taste starts to change. Most people think taste comes from ingredients. That is partly true, but in modern food production, taste is also the result of design. Specific combinations are tested over and over again to see what people respond to most consistently. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that feels artificial right away, but in a way that makes the food easy to keep eating. There is even a term used in research for this category: hyper-palatable foods. These are foods that combine certain elements in very specific ratios: fat and salt, sugar and fat, refined carbohydrates and sodium. When these combinations are balanced correctly, they create a very strong response. You do not need to think about it. You just keep going back for another bite. This does not mean the food is dangerous by default, but it does mean it is designed with a different goal. Instead of simply satisfying hunger, it is built to maintain interest. That difference is subtle, but it matters. Think about how you feel after eating something simple. A basic meal made from whole ingredients tends to have a clear stopping point. You feel done. The experience ends. Now compare that to highly processed snacks or packaged foods. The flavor is often more intense at the start, but less memorable overall. You may not even remember exactly how it tasted, but you remember wanting more. That is not an accident. It is the result of repeated testing and adjustment. Small changes in salt levels, slight shifts in sweetness, texture engineered to create a certain bite or crunch. Everything tuned to reduce friction and increase repeat consumption. Over time, this changes expectations. Food becomes less about a complete experience and more about a continuous one. Something you can return to again and again without thinking too much about it. And when that becomes normal, simpler food can start to feel less satisfying by comparison. Not because it is worse, but because it plays by different rules. So now you have two layers working at the same time. Food is more controlled in how it is made and more engineered in how it tastes. But there is another layer people notice even faster than taste: how it looks. Before people notice ingredients or even taste, they notice something simpler: how food looks. Walk through any grocery store and you will see the same pattern. Apples that are nearly identical in size and color. Lettuce that looks clean and untouched from edge to edge. Packaged meals that look exactly the same every time you buy them. This level of consistency did not happen by accident. It comes from selection sorting and standardization at every stage. Crops are bred and chosen for appearance. Produce is filtered so only certain sizes and shapes make it to shelves. Packaged food is produced in controlled environments where variation is minimized as much as possible. From a business perspective, this makes sense. Consistency builds trust. When something looks the same every time, people know what to expect. But there is a side effect. Natural food is not consistent. In a less controlled environment, you would expect variation, different shapes, slight color changes, small imperfections. That variation is part of what signals that something is fresh and unprocessed. When that variation disappears, the signal changes. Everything starts to look cleaner, more uniform, more precise. At first, that feels like an improvement. But over time, it can start to feel unnatural, even if people cannot explain why. Because perfection is not something most people associate with food. They associate it with manufacturing. And once that connection forms, it changes how everything else is perceived. The taste, the texture, even the shelf life, all of it starts to feel like it belongs to a system, not a farm or a kitchen. So even before reading a label or thinking about ingredients, people are already forming an impression. Food looks more controlled than it used to. And that raises a new question. If the outside is this consistent, what about everything else behind it? At this point, most people do what seems logical. They turn the package around and read the label. And that is where things start to get more confusing, not less. Because the words on food packaging do not always mean what people think they mean. Not because they are false, but because they are defined differently than how consumers interpret them. Take something like natural flavor. To most people, that sounds simple. It suggests something close to the original ingredient. But in practice, it refers to how a flavor is derived, not how simple or recognizable it is. The process behind it can still be complex. Or consider phrases like no artificial color. That sounds straightforward. But it does not necessarily mean the product is free from heavy processing. It only refers to a specific category of additives, not the entire production method. Then there are terms like bioengineered ingredient. Most people do not fully understand what that implies. The label exists, but the explanation behind it is not always clear at a glance. So the issue is not that labels are lying. The issue is that they are speaking a different language. They follow regulatory definitions. Consumers rely on everyday meaning, and those two do not always match. That gap creates friction. People read something that sounds reassuring, but they are not fully confident in what it actually means. Over time, that uncertainty builds. And this is where a lot of the feeling starts to take shape. Because when someone cannot easily understand what they are looking at, they start to question it. Not necessarily reject it, but question it. That is a key part of why food feels different now. It is not just how it behaves or how it tastes. It is how difficult it has become to interpret. Even simple products come with layers of information that require context to understand. And most people are not going to research every term while standing in a grocery aisle. So instead, they rely on instinct. And when instinct and labeling do not line up, the default reaction is uncertainty. That uncertainty does not stay isolated to one product. It spreads from one label to another, from one category to the next. And eventually, it becomes a broader question. If it is this hard to understand what food is, what else is happening behind the scenes? To understand what is really driving these changes, you have to step back from the product and look at the system around it. Food today is not just produced. It is moved, stored, distributed, and managed at a massive scale. A single item on a grocery shelf may have traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles before it reaches the store. It may have been harvested early, stored in controlled environments, transported through multiple facilities, and kept stable the entire time. That process introduces a different set of priorities. Freshness still matters, but it is no longer the only concern. Food also has to survive time. It has to remain visually acceptable. It has to arrive in a condition that can be sold, not just consumed. That changes how decisions are made at the very beginning. Produce is often picked before it is fully ripe because fully ripe food does not travel well. Ripening may happen later, sometimes during transport or storage. This helps reduce waste, but it also changes how the final product behaves and tastes. The same logic applies across categories. Shelf life becomes a central factor. Products are designed to last longer, maintain structure, and avoid rapid spoilage. Packaging is optimized to protect appearance and extend usability. Every step is built to reduce loss across the system. From an operational perspective, this is efficient. Less waste means lower costs. Longer shelf life means more flexibility in distribution. Standardization makes planning easier. But from a consumer perspective, the experience shifts. Food becomes less tied to time and place. It is no longer something that changes quickly or unpredictably. It is something that holds. And that holding effect is one of the reasons people start to feel a disconnect. Because traditionally, food signaled its condition clearly. You could see when something was fresh, when it was ripening, and when it was no longer good. Now those signals are less obvious. Not gone, but delayed or altered. And when those signals change, it becomes harder to rely on instinct. So while nothing here is inherently wrong, the system introduces a different kind of relationship between people and food. It becomes more controlled, more stable, and more predictable from a logistics standpoint, but at the same time, less intuitive from a human one. At this scale, consistency does not happen on its own. It has to be managed. When food is produced in small quantities, variation is expected. When it is produced in massive volumes, variation becomes a risk. A single issue can affect thousands of units at once. That changes how the system operates. Take meat processing as an example. In a large facility, thousands of animals may be processed within a short period of time. That creates efficiency, but it also increases the chance of contamination spreading if something goes wrong. To manage that risk, the system relies on approved antimicrobial treatments and controlled processing steps. These are regulated and widely used. They are not hidden. But most consumers never see this part of the process, so when they hear about it, it feels unfamiliar. The same pattern applies to other types of food. Grains are refined to improve stability. Oils are processed to extend shelf life. Ingredients are treated, adjusted, and standardized, so they behave the same way across large batches. From a production standpoint, this is necessary. Without these steps, it would be much harder to supply food at the scale people expect today. Availability would drop, costs would rise, waste would increase. But there is a side effect. The more intervention required to maintain consistency, the further the final product moves from what people imagine as simple food. Not fake but managed. And that distinction matters, because most people are not reacting to the existence of processing. Processing has always existed. What feels different now is the level of control involved. Food is no longer just prepared. It is stabilized, adjusted, and maintained throughout its entire life cycle. And when people start to understand that even at a basic level, it changes how they see what is in front of them. At this point, it is easy to assume there must be a single authority fully in control of all of this. In reality, the system is more reactive than that. Regulation exists, and in many cases, it is strict. Agencies like the FDA and USDA review ingredients, processing methods, and safety standards. Products are tested. Guidelines are updated. Certain additives have been restricted or removed over time. But there is a timing gap. Food production evolves quickly. New techniques, new ingredients, and new formulations are introduced constantly. Companies test, adjust, and scale products in relatively short cycles. Regulation moves differently. It requires review evidence and consensus. That process takes time. So what often happens is not a lack of oversight, but a delay between innovation and full evaluation. During that window, products can be widely used while understanding is still developing. Again, this does not automatically mean something is unsafe, but it does contribute to perception. When people hear that an ingredient was allowed for years and then later restricted, it raises questions. Not just about that one case, but about the system as a whole. It creates the sense that the rules are always catching up. And when you combine that with everything else, the processing, the labeling, the scale, it adds another layer to the same underlying feeling. Not necessarily that something is wrong, but that the system is moving faster than most people can follow. By this point, most of the changes are not hidden. People can see the labels. They can hear about processing. They can read articles or watch videos explaining how food is made. The problem is not a lack of information. It is that the information does not come together in a clear way. One source says something is safe. Another questions it. One label sounds reassuring. Another raises more questions. Even basic terms can mean different things depending on context. So instead of clarity, people get overlap. And when that happens, most people do not try to resolve every detail. They rely on a simpler reaction. They trust what feels consistent and question what does not. That is where the shift happens. Because food used to be something people understood without much effort. You could look at it, cook it, taste it, and have a reasonable sense of what it was. Now that process is less straightforward. Not because people are less informed, but because the system behind the food is more complex than what is visible on the surface. So when something feels slightly off, even if it has a logical explanation, it does not get resolved immediately. It stays in the background. And over time, those small unresolved questions start to add up. Not into a single conclusion, but into a general feeling. That food is harder to trust than it used to be. At this point, there is a temptation to look for a single cause, a specific ingredient, a specific process, a specific decision. But that is not how this shift happened. Several things changed at the same time. Food production scaled up. Processing became more advanced. Supply chains became longer and more efficient. Products were designed to last longer, look better, and taste more consistent. None of these changes are unusual on their own. In fact, each one solves a real problem. Scaling production makes food more available. Processing improves stability. Longer shelf life reduces waste. Consistency makes products easier to trust at a glance. But when all of these changes happen together, they create a gap. On one side, you have a system that is optimized for efficiency, predictability, and control. On the other side, you have expectations built from a different model of food. One that is less controlled, more variable, and easier to understand without explanation. That gap is where the feeling comes from. Food looks better, lasts longer, and behaves more consistently within the system it was designed for. But it does not always match the patterns people learned from earlier experiences. So the issue is not that food is fake in a literal sense. It is that the definition of food has shifted while expectations have not fully caught up. And when those two things fall out of sync, even small differences start to stand out. That is why something can look completely normal, pass every safety standard, and still feel slightly unfamiliar. Not because it is wrong, but because it was built for a different set of priorities. So when people say food feels different now, they are not reacting to just one thing. They are reacting to a system that has changed in multiple ways at once. Food is more processed. It moves through longer supply chains. It is designed to last longer, look more consistent, and behave predictably across large-scale production. At the same time, most expectations about food have not changed as quickly. People still rely on simple signals. How something looks, how it tastes, how it changes over time. When those signals no longer match what people expect, even small differences start to stand out. Not enough to reject the food, but enough to notice. So the next time something feels slightly off, it may not be about one product. It may be the result of a system that has become more efficient, but also more complex than it used to be.